He'd ordered men killed without so much as blinking. Yet at midnight during the worst blizzard Chicago had seen in a decade, Rourke Halloran hit the brakes for a homeless woman, shivering at an abandoned bus stop. And that single decision would either save them both, or bury them side by side. 2 hours earlier, the most feared crime boss on the South Side had walked into a meeting he trusted with his life and walked out with a bullet in his side, 2 loyal men dead on the floor, and the sick certainty that the older man his own father had taken in and raised beside him, the brother he'd trusted more than anyone alive, had just tried to erase him. Now he was driving a stranger's car through streets he couldn't recognize, bleeding through his shirt, calling every soldier, every lawyer, every man who owed him everything on his main line. And nobody, not a single one, was picking up. The open network he controlled was dead. For the first time in his life, the empire he'd built on fear had gone completely silent, and then his headlights caught her. A woman sitting perfectly still at a bus stop where no bus had run in 3 hours, wearing a red dress meant for a night that clearly hadn't gone the way she'd planned. A thin white chiffon coat, doing absolutely nothing against the cold that was trying to kill her. She wasn't checking a phone. She wasn't waving him down. She was just sitting there with the kind of stillness that comes when a person has run completely out of options. He should have kept driving. A man in his position didn't stop for strangers, especially not the night half his organization had turned on him. But something about her wouldn't let him press the gas. When he got close enough to see her face, he expected fear, because everyone was afraid of him. Instead, she looked at the blood soaking his side before she ever looked at his eyes, and in a voice worn down to almost nothing, she said, "You're bleeding internally. You've got maybe an hour before that kills you." She wasn't guessing. This woman freezing at a bus stop in a cocktail dress had the steady, exhausted eyes of someone who used to save lives for a living, someone the world had chewed up and thrown out for the crime of doing the right thing. Her name was Greta Voss, 27 years old, an ER nurse who'd lost everything for refusing to stay quiet about a truth nobody wanted told, and she had no idea that the dying man in front of her was the most dangerous person in the city. She only knew what she'd always known, the one thing 8 brutal months on the street hadn't managed to take from her. You don't walk away from someone who's dying. What neither of them understood yet was that the very hospital that had destroyed her life, and the men who'd just tried to end his, were tangled up in the same dark web, that their ruin had been written by the same hands, and that they now had exactly 7 hours before sunrise, when the man who'd betrayed Rourke would stand in front of the family and declare him dead. 7 hours to expose a traitor, save a life, and figure out why a woman with nothing left to give was the only person in this city willing to give a damn. If you believe there's still good left in people who've been knocked all the way down, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs the reminder that kindness still counts for something. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's go back to that frozen bus stop, and I'll tell you exactly what happened next. Rourke didn't answer her right away, and in that silence his mind ran faster than the pain in his side, weighing every possibility in the same way he had weighed everything in his life, assessing it, tearing it apart, searching for the trap hidden underneath. This woman knew he was bleeding inside. This woman had said the number 1 hour as though she were reading it off some invisible chart. Who planted her here? Who paid her to sit at this exact bus stop, on this exact night, waiting for him to drive past? He had lived long enough in a world where kindness always came with an invoice attached, where every outstretched hand hid a blade behind its back, and that ancient instinct was now screaming at him to hit the gas and leave. But one thing didn't fit. She wasn't looking at him the way people looked at prey. She wasn't looking at him the way people looked at Rourke Halloran. She looked at the wound first, then at his face, and in those exhausted eyes there was no calculation, no fear, only the raw weariness of someone who had grown used to watching other people die. That unsettled him more than the barrel of a gun pointed at his face. He knew how to handle fear. He had built an entire empire on fear. What he didn't know how to handle was someone so indifferent to his power that she didn't even bother acknowledging that it existed. She coughed, a dry, broken fit of sound, pulling her paper-thin chiffon coat tighter around herself in vain, and when she saw that he was still silent, she went on in a voice that had almost run out of breath. "I don't need you to believe me. I don't need you to tell me who you are. I truly don't care. But if you keep standing there wondering whether I'm a trap, you'll die before you find the answer. And I don't want to sit next to another corpse tonight." That sentence touched someplace inside him he had thought had gone numb long ago. In all his years of power, no one had dared speak to him that way. People measured every word in front of him. People laughed when he wanted them to laugh. People trembled when he wanted them to tremble. And now a woman shaking in a fragile red dress, with no home, no vehicle, not even a working phone, was speaking to him as though he were the more pitiful one between them. The pain in his side surged so hard that it forced him to grip the edge of the driver's seat, and at the same time he understood one cold truth. She was right. Time wasn't on his side. Every minute he wasted here interrogating her motives was another minute. His blood kept pooling where it had no right to pool. He could die. The thought didn't frighten him in the way ordinary people were frightened, but it reminded him that if he died tonight, the person who had shot him would win, and that was something he couldn't tolerate. "All right," he said, his voice rough and hoarse, those two words costing him more than she could possibly imagine, because for this man, placing his life in the hands of a stranger, ran against everything he had ever learned in order to survive. She nodded, not relieved, not triumphant, only shifting immediately into the rhythm of someone who had once known her work, rising unsteadily and gripping the metal roof of the shelter, then giving him orders instead of asking permission. "Where's your car? Can you walk on your own? Don't try to act fine. I need to know exactly how much strength you have left so I know how much time I have." He jerked his head toward the car parked at an angle across the street, its lights still glowing dimly through the snow, and she looked at it, then looked back at him with something flickering across her face, not suspicion about who he was, only the recognition that the car was too expensive, too clean, too out of place in this neighborhood. But she swallowed the question and didn't ask it, exactly as she had just said. She didn't care. The two of them helped each other across the snow-covered road, his heavy body leaning partly against her shoulder, even though every part of him resisted relying on anyone, and she took that weight without a single complaint, her thin shoes sliding over the ice, both their breaths mingling into white smoke that vanished at once in the wind. When she opened the car door and helped him into the passenger seat, then circled around and took the wheel, the hand she placed on it was still trembling from the cold, but her eyes had changed. They had sharpened, cleared, become the eyes of someone who had just found a reason not to collapse for one more night. He leaned his head back, pressing his palm hard against the wound, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, he closed his eyes in front of a human being whose name he didn't even know, entrusting the next few hours of his survival to a stranger. His instincts told him to distrust, while his intuition whispered that she might be the only person in the whole city tonight who didn't want him dead. The car rolled slowly through the deep snow, and the first thing Greta said, once she had a firm grip on the wheel, was the only thing that made sense. "The nearest hospital is about 15 minutes away if the roads aren't too bad. I'll take you into the emergency room. They have blood. They have an operating room. They have things I don't have. You need that right now." But he shook his head before she had even finished speaking, a refusal so decisive it made her frown. "No hospital," he said, his voice low and hard as cold steel. She glanced over, thinking he was delirious from blood loss, and tried again in the patient voice she had once used with stubborn patience. "Listen, I understand men like you hate hospitals, but a wound like yours isn't something that can be handled on your own. If blood has already pooled in the abdominal cavity, I can't stop it with my bare hands. You go in there or you die. It's that simple." He turned his face toward her. In the pale glow of the dashboard she saw something that sent a chill along her spine. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of seeing. "No hospital," he repeated. "They record names. They call the police when there's a gunshot wound, and there are people waiting to hear that I'm dead. If I walk into an emergency room tonight, by morning I really will be dead. Just not because of this wound." The sentence dropped into the silence of the car like a stone falling into a deep well, and for the first time Greta truly studied the man beside her, the expensive shirt now soaked with blood, the watch on his wrist worth more than an entire year of her old salary, the way he spoke of a gunshot wound as calmly as other people talked about the weather, and a cold suspicion began to form inside her. She didn't know who he was, but she was beginning to understand that he belonged to a world decent people should stay far away from. She could pull over right now. She could open the door, step out, and disappear into the snow, leaving him with his wound and the world that had followed him here. The thought crossed her mind very quickly, and just as quickly she pushed it away, because whatever he was, at this moment he was still a body losing blood beside her, and 8 months on the streets had not stripped that final reflex out of her. Beside her, he was visibly getting worse, his breathing shallower, sweat beading on his forehead though the car was freezing cold, and when she reached over to touch his neck and check his pulse, her fingertips registered the thing she feared most, fast and weak, his body trying to compensate for the blood it had lost, and that compensation wouldn't last long. "All right," she said, the professional part of her mind sweeping every moral hesitation aside. "No hospital? Then I need somewhere closed off, with water, with light, with a place to lay you down, and I know a place." She turned the wheel off the main road, slipping into a neighborhood where almost all the streetlights had gone out, where rows of abandoned houses stood silent like skeletons in the snow, and at the end of the alley an old church appeared, closed for years, its windows boarded over, the cross on its roof leaning crookedly, a place the city had forgotten, and the people forgotten by the city had quietly claimed as shelter. She parked behind the brick wall, so the car would be hidden from the road, then turned to him. "This isn't a hospital, and I don't have half of what I need, but no one here will record your name. No one will call anyone, and there are people here who won't ask you a single question. That's all I can give you tonight." He looked at the ruined building through the fogged glass. A kingpin used to wood-paneled rooms and security doors now about to entrust his life to an abandoned church. And perhaps because he was too exhausted to resist, or because for the first time in his life he realized he had no better choice left, he only gave a faint nod. Greta got out of the car, came around to open his door, and when the heavy wooden door of the church cracked open from inside, an old face appeared in the darkness, wary but not hostile, and she murmured a few words of reassurance to that person, before helping the dying man across the threshold into the world of those who had nothing left. That aged face belonged to a man named Wendell, his snow-white hair tangled beneath a worn knit cap, his eyes marked by many brutal winters, and yet still holding a kind of light that was both wary and decent. And when Greta whispered that she needed space and needed help, he asked nothing more. He only glanced for 1 second at the spreading blood stain on the stranger's shirt, then stepped back to let them through. "I'll hold the light for you," he said hoarsely in the voice of a man who had not spoken much in a long time. Inside, the church was dark and cold, the damp smell of rotting wood mixed with smoke from an iron barrel smoldering in the corner. A few figures curled beneath torn blankets scattered among the crooked pews. No one looked up. No one showed curiosity. Here, people had learned that what belonged to someone else was best left to that someone else. Greta helped Rourke lie down on a long pew, where Wendell had hurriedly spread the cleanest blanket he had. Then she knelt and began to work, first tearing open the blood-soaked shirt to expose the wound, and when she saw it clearly beneath the weak beam of the flashlight, Wendell pointed toward her. She cursed softly, not out of disgust, but out of exhaustion, and because she knew she was missing far too many things. She looked back at Wendell. "I need boiling water, as much as possible. My kit hidden behind the statue base, needle and thread. A bottle of alcohol if there's even a drop left, and a light brighter than this one. Hurry." Wendell didn't ask a single question. He disappeared into the darkness with the surprising speed of someone used to making do with nothing, and while she waited, Greta pressed her palm hard against the wound to slow the bleeding, pressing so firmly that Rourke hissed through his teeth. "Lie still," she snapped. "I know it hurts, but if you thrash around, I'll have to start over, and I don't have spare blood for you to waste." She wasn't gentle. She was irritable, and her hands trembled from cold, from hunger, from too many hours without rest, but those hands were still precise, still knew exactly where to press and how much pressure to use, the kind of knowledge no fall from grace could wash out of her. When Wendell brought the water and her poor little kit, she poured alcohol over her hands, over the needle, then began to stitch, 1 stitch at a time, slow and steady, gritting her teeth every time the needle pierced the flesh of the man who was bracing himself to endure it without a single cry, and she spoke in an even voice to keep him conscious. "Don't close your eyes for long. Say something. Count backward from 100 for me if you can't think of anything to say. I need to know you're still here with me." Rourke, the man who had never allowed anyone to give him orders, counted, his voice broken and hoarse, and as he counted, he looked at her, truly looked at her, watching the way she worked, and what he saw made him forget the pain for a moment. He saw a woman who had nothing left of her own and was still giving away everything she had. He saw the way she stopped midway to pull a blanket over an old woman shivering on the pew beside them before turning back to his wound. He saw the way Wendell stood nearby, holding the light with the devotion of a man ready to do whatever she needed without asking for anything. And he realized that this woman had built loyalty at the very bottom of society, the kind of loyalty his entire empire of money had never been able to buy. When the final stitch was tied and Greta dropped heavily onto the floor, gasping for breath, sweat and melted snow clinging to her forehead, she spoke without looking at him. "I've stopped the outside bleeding, but inside, I'm not sure. You're not out of danger. Don't thank me yet." Wendell quietly set a cup of warm water and a piece of hard bread beside her, the last of his own food, and he only said, "Eat. When you work, you have to eat." Then he retreated to his corner, as though what he had just done was hardly worth mentioning, and Rourke lay there in the darkness of the church, watching the two poorest people he had ever met divide the last bit of food between them, and something very old and very hard inside him shifted slightly. Greta bit into the hard bread, then set the rest down beside Wendell when he wasn't looking, a quiet way of giving it back, and sat with her back against the leg of the pew where Rourke was lying, the two of them held in the flickering darkness of the fire barrel. Neither of them said anything for a long while, until he spoke in a voice that was still weak. "Are you a doctor?" "No," she answered, her eyes still on the flame. "A nurse. Emergency room. Almost 6 years." She fell silent long enough that he thought the story had ended there. Then she went on in the flat voice of someone who had told this story inside her own head so many times that it could no longer make her cry. "There was a doctor where I worked," she said. "Good, respected, with his name on the wall, but he came in for his shift with liquor on his breath more than once, and one night he mishandled a case that should have been simple. A little boy, and that little boy didn't get to go home anymore." She stopped, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup of warm water. "I reported it," she continued. "I did exactly what they teach you to do. I filled out the right form. I spoke to the right people, or at least the people I thought I was supposed to speak to, and I thought that would be the end of it. I thought the truth would be strong enough to stand on its own." Rourke lay still and listened without interrupting, and in the darkness he could clearly hear her voice changing, from flat to something bitter that had hardened into stone. "But people didn't want to listen," she said. "He had friends. He had people who needed him to stay quiet and needed me to stay quiet with him. And when I wouldn't, suddenly I was the problem. My record started growing mistakes I had never made. My shifts disappeared. Then one morning I came to work and my badge wouldn't open the door anymore. And when I applied somewhere else, no one called back, as if my name had been written on some list I wasn't allowed to see." He asked softly, "What about your family?" "My mother was sick through all of that," she said, "and medicine bills don't wait for anyone. I sold what I could sell. I borrowed from wherever I could borrow. Then my mother died, leaving me with a bill as long as my arm and an apartment I couldn't afford. My husband had already left before that. He said he couldn't stand living with someone who kept insisting on doing the right thing, while the right thing was killing us both." She laughed, a short laugh with no happiness in it at all. 8 months, she said. 8 months to fall from being someone who saved people to being someone sitting at a bus stop where no bus was coming. And do you know the saddest part? I still don't regret speaking up. I only regret being naive enough to believe the world would reward me for it. Rourke said nothing, and his silence wasn't indifference. It was the silence of a man being shaken at the root, because his whole life he had been taught the opposite. His father had told him when he was a boy that kindness was a luxury only those who had never paid the price dared to keep, that this world devoured decent people, and the only reward for honesty was being used. And he had lived his entire life by that teaching. He had built a whole empire on the belief that trusting people was the shortest road to death. And yet now before him was a human being who proved that his father might have been right about the price, but completely wrong about people, because this woman had paid the highest price and still refused to sell off the decent part of herself. "Is there anyone still waiting for you?" he asked, and she shook her head. "Not anymore." Then she asked him in return, "What about you? Is anyone waiting for you? He was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "One person. My grandmother. She's the only one left waiting for me to come home." And in the way he said the words "my grandmother," Greta heard the one soft place inside this man made of stone. One fragile thread still tying him to the human part of himself he thought he had lost long ago. That soft thread had not even had time to settle when the phone in Rourke's coat pocket vibrated. Not the broken one, but a second phone he kept hidden close to his body. And while he was still too weak to reach for it, Greta instinctively slipped her hand in and took it out for him. The screen flared bright in the darkness of the church, and on it appeared a name and a line of text that made her fingers freeze in midair. And before she could give it back, her eyes had already read something she shouldn't have read. A short, cold message mentioning cleanup, keeping the port quiet, mentioning the name Halloran, as though it were a dynasty and not a man. She sat motionless and slowly. All the scattered pieces from the night began to fit together with a sound that chilled her spine. The gravity of the words on the glowing screen hit her. This wasn't a simple street war. It was an execution order. Everything now reeled in her mind, his chilling indifference to the bullet in his side, his desperate fear of being seen by the world, and now this name, the name even someone living on the edge of society like her had heard whispered in the dark corners of the city. Halloran, the boss of the South Side. The man people didn't dare say too loudly. Greta set the phone down on the floor very slowly, as though it might explode. Then she stood and stepped back, 1 step, 2 steps, staring at the man she had just spent nearly an hour pulling out of death's hands. And for the first time that night, what showed on her face wasn't exhaustion, but something close to horror. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse, though she already knew. "I'm asking you who you are." Rourke didn't deny it. He didn't have the strength to deny it, and he wasn't the kind of man who denied things. He only looked at her with tired eyes and gave her the bare truth. "You already know who I am. I can see it on your face." A choked laugh escaped her without becoming sound, and she lifted a hand to cover her mouth, then let it fall again. "I just stitched up a Mafia boss," she said, almost to herself. "I just fed you the last piece of bread belonging to a homeless old man. I just used the profession they took away from me, because I did the right thing to save the life of a man who may have taken the lives of countless others." Her hands trembled, not from the cold anymore, but because the entire set of values she had paid for, with her whole life to preserve, was now shaking violently, because she was the woman who had lost everything for refusing to compromise with what was wrong, and now those very hands had just dragged what was wrong back from death. She picked up her thin chiffon coat, her fingers fumbling. "I have to go," she said. I can't do this. You have your people. Call them. They'll come take care of you." Then she remembered, the moment the words had left her mouth, that no one was coming, that all night no one had answered him, and that truth appeared on her face at the same time it appeared on his. They both understood that if she walked through the church door, he would die alone in the dark on the rotting wooden pew. "Go," he said quietly, making her go still. "I'm not keeping you here. You don't owe me anything. You've already done more for me than anyone in this world ever has. Just go." And it was that permission, that letting go without demanding anything, that held her at the threshold, because if he had begged, she could have left. If he had threatened her, she could have left, but he only lay there accepting death like a man who had grown used to the idea that in the end no one stayed for him. Greta stood between the door and the pew. On one side, her conscience telling her she must not get involved in his world. On the other, that same conscience telling her that if she abandoned a dying man, she would no longer be the person she had sacrificed everything to remain. And in that torn moment, Wendell spoke softly from the dark corner. "Everyone gets a night when fate places another human being in their hands, child, and what you do tonight is yours, not his." She closed her eyes for a long time, then opened them again, and did not walk through the door. She came back and sat down, but kept her distance, her arms wrapped around her knees, and said in a voice that had gone hard, "I'll stay until you make it through tonight, that's all, then I'm leaving, and I don't want to know anything else about you." But Rourke was looking at her with a different gaze now, one that had sharpened inside his exhaustion, as though while she had been telling him the story of her life, something had locked into place in his mind, and was only now breaking open. "What was the name of your hospital?" he asked. She frowned. "What does that have to do with anything?" But he repeated it, patient and strangely steady, the name of the hospital, The name of the place that fired you. Tell me." She said it, and when the name left her lips, a heavy silence fell between them, because Rourke closed his eyes very slowly, and when he opened them again, he spoke in a low voice that sounded almost disbelieving. "I know that place. I know that place better than you think." Greta sat up straighter, something in her chest beginning to tighten. "The network that crushed you," he said. "The people who silenced you, who rewrote your records, who put your name on a list so no one would dare hire you again. You always thought it was just a doctor with a few powerful friends protecting one another, but it's much bigger than that. That hospital has been a money laundering machine for years. Dirty money goes in through phantom bills, patients who don't exist, fake payments, and then it comes out spotless and clean. And the person running that operation wasn't your doctor. Your doctor was only a pawn they kept around because he could sign the things they needed signed." Greta shook her head. "I don't understand. What are you talking about?" And Rourke said the doctor's name, Abernathy, the man she had reported, the man because of whom her whole life had collapsed, and he said Abernathy owed debts he could never repay. And people didn't clear those debts for him with money, but with signatures. He was the link that legitimized the flow of money moving through the hospital. And the night you walked in with your report, you weren't only threatening a drunk doctor, you had accidentally put your hand into the middle of a machine worth millions of dollars, one that many dangerous people needed to keep turning. She sat in stunned silence, the whole church seeming to shrink around her, because for 8 months she had believed she had been destroyed by the cowardice of a bureaucratic system, by ordinary people who chose to close their eyes in order to keep themselves safe, and now she understood that the truth was colder than that. She had been crushed deliberately, systematically, by hands that didn't want an honest emergency room nurse seeing too much. "Who?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who's behind that machine?" Rourke was silent for a long beat, as if weighing whether to pull her deeper into this abyss. Then he said quietly, "The same people who shot me tonight. The same hand, Greta. The hand that wrote your downfall and the hand that just tried to erase me are the same hand. We had been standing at opposite ends of the same rope long before you saw me at that bus stop, and neither of us knew it." Greta lifted a hand to cover her mouth, her whole body going cold, not from the chill of the church, but from the dizzying realization that she hadn't stopped tonight by chance, that the 8-month slide of her life and the bullet in this man's side were 2 branches of the same black river, and she understood at once, before Rourke could say another word, that she would no longer be able to walk through that door and pretend tonight had never happened, because the one who had taken her life away and the one now trying to take his were the same, and for the first time in 8 months she felt something she had thought had died inside her. Not hope, but anger, sharp and hot and alive. That anger changed her voice. She was no longer someone who wanted to run, but someone who wanted to understand. "All right," she said. "If it's the same hand, then tell me, who, and why tonight, and what do you plan to do with that wound inside you?" Rourke forced himself to sit up a little higher, his face pale but his mind coldly clear, and he began to lay out for her the timeline tightening around his throat. "The man who shot me can't simply announce that he's taking over," he said. "In my world, everything needs the appearance of legitimacy. It needs the district leaders to nod and recognize it, and those men won't recognize someone who crowns himself with a bullet in my back unless I'm truly dead. So by dawn, he'll summon all of them to the main building and stand in front of them declaring that I was killed by a rival during the night, that he is the only one still qualified to keep everything from collapsing. And once those leaders believe that, they'll lean toward him, not out of loyalty, but because they're afraid of standing on the wrong side of a corpse." Greta looked toward the boarded window, where the first gray hints of morning were still very far away. "How long?" she asked, and he answered, "About 7 hours, maybe less. When the sun comes up, everything will be settled." "Then why don't you call someone to prove you're still alive?" she asked, and that question touched the second wound in him. "I did call," he said quietly. "I've been calling all night, and you already know what happened." No one answered. Either they've been bought, or they're waiting to see which way the wind turns, or they're on the ground like my 2 men tonight. So if I keep calling, all I'm doing is letting him know where I'm still alive, and he'll come finish what he started." "Then what do you need?" Greta asked directly, the rational, professional part of her having completely taken over. The mind that was used to making decisions in the chaos of an emergency room, now sorting the problem like triage. What had to come first? What could be discarded? What would kill him fastest if it wasn't handled? "There's a safe," he said, "in my office at the main building. Inside it is the only thing that can turn this around. Recordings, money trails, black and white proof showing that he's the traitor, not me. If I can get that out in front of the leaders before he finishes staging his performance, then he'll be the one on his knees, not me. But that building is in his hands now, and I'm like this." Greta looked down at the stitches she had just made, looked at the color of his skin, and said in the cold, calculating voice of a nurse measuring the strength left in a patient, "You can't make it there, never mind climb or run. You've lost too much blood. If you push yourself in the next few hours, the internal wound will open wider, and this time I won't be able to save you. So whatever plan there is has to account for the fact that you're working with only half your strength." He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes almost like respect. She didn't ask whether he was guilty or innocent. She didn't demand promises from him. She was simply calculating exactly what was possible with the resources they had, just as she had calculated his life at the bus stop. "There's one more thing," he said, and his voice sank. "There's someone I have to know is safe before I do anything. My grandmother, Maeve. She's in a small house north of the city, and he knows the address. If he suspects I'm alive, she'll be the first place he looks. I need to know she's all right. That's the only thing in this world I won't bargain with." Greta nodded slowly, remembering that name, remembering the one soft place inside this man made of stone. Then she said, "Then we have 7 hours and a body running at only half capacity. Tell me everything, every detail. Because if I'm going to risk my life for your trouble, I need to know at least what I'm walking into." "His name is Cillian," Rourke began, and the name left his mouth as heavily as something he had carried for too long. "My father took him in when he was just a homeless boy, a few years older than me, and raised him in our own house, fed him at the same table, taught him the same lessons, let him sleep under the same roof. So through all my childhood he was my brother, not by blood, but by everything else." Greta listened, and in Rourke's voice she heard something more complicated than simple hatred. "My father trusted him," he went on. "Trusted him with things he didn't give to anyone else. And Cillian was good, better than me at a lot of things. He was more patient, he calculated further ahead. He understood this business down to every corner, and for years he believed, and maybe he had reason to believe, that when my father died, he would be the one to inherit. But he wasn't," Greta said softly, and Rourke nodded. "He wasn't, because in my father's world, blood was the one thing that couldn't be bought, couldn't be learned, couldn't be earned, no matter how much a man deserved it. My father may have loved Cillian like a son, but when the time came to hand everything over, he chose me, only because I carried the Halloran name, and Cillian didn't, and I remember the night my father announced it. I remember Cillian's face. He didn't say a word, he only smiled and congratulated me, and I was stupid enough to believe that smile was real. He stopped, breathing heavily, and the worst thing is that I played my part too, I admit that. I treated him like a subordinate for years. I let him stand behind me in every room. I took credit for plans he had thought up. I never once told him that without him, I wouldn't have been able to hold this thing together. I took his loyalty as something that simply belonged to me. And a man may endure being pushed away from the throne, but no one can endure being treated as though he doesn't exist year after year." Greta looked at him, and she said what both of them were thinking. "You're describing how people create a monster. You take someone who has been dismissed long enough, and one day that person decides that if the world won't give them a place, they'll seize one for themselves at any cost." Rourke was silent, because she was right, and that rightness tasted bitter. He couldn't call Cillian simply evil when he himself had helped shape the blade now driven into his back. "But even if I understand Cillian," he continued, his voice hardening, "that doesn't mean I'll let him win. Understanding why a man becomes a killer doesn't mean standing still and letting him kill you. And Cillian doesn't just want the chair now. He wants to erase every trace of me so no one will ever question how he got it." At that moment, Rourke's second phone lit up again, not with a call, but with an automatic alert from one of the few people still loyal to him, a short message reporting that Cillian's men were checking traffic cameras across the city, following the car he had used to escape, and Rourke read it, then closed his eyes. "They're tracing my route," he said. "It's only a matter of time before they track it to this area." The message also mentioned a name, a young man newly brought into the organization named Petey, only 19 years old. The boy Cillian had taken along with the hunting team, and Rourke murmured almost to himself. That boy is too young to understand who he's serving. Cillian always chooses boys like that, boys with no home, no one waiting for them, boys he can mold any way he wants, just like my father once molded him, and that circle keeps turning. And Greta stored Petey's name in her mind without yet knowing why, only knowing that in this dark story, one more human being had just appeared who might still be saved. That matter of time ran out faster than anyone was ready for, because less than half an hour later, Wendell rushed in from his post at the door, frighteningly quick for a man his age. "Car lights," he whispered, "2 of them, headlights off, crawling slow at the mouth of the alley, not police." Greta shot to her feet at once, all exhaustion gone, replaced by the icy alertness of someone who had worked through the most chaotic nights, and she pulled Rourke upright despite the hiss of pain that tore from him. "Get up, walk as far as you can, lean on me, right now." Outside came the soft thud of car doors closing, then the sound of several feet crunching through the snow, and in the darkness of the church the other homeless people silently shifted into corners, accustomed to the art of becoming invisible. Wendell stopped Greta at the back passage. "Not that way," he said. "That leads out into the open. They'll see you both right away. There's an old sewer passage behind the statue pedestal that connects to the abandoned building across the way. I'll show you." He led them through a narrow gap behind the wall, pushed aside the board covering a pitch-black sewer opening, and said, "Down here. Go straight. At the end there's a cover that opens into the west alley. Don't stop." Greta helped Rourke climb down first, then looked back for Wendell. "You're coming with us, aren't you?" But the old man shook his head, his eyes calm beneath the frayed brim of his knit cap. "They're looking for 2 people," he said, "not an old man. I'll go out there and keep them busy. You get him far away." "No," Greta whispered fiercely. "No. You come down here with us. I'm not leaving you." But Wendell only placed his calloused hand on her shoulder for 1 second. "You gave me something tonight I haven't had in a very long time," he said. "You needed me. Let me be useful one last time. Go." Then he turned away, and before she could argue another word, he stepped out into the front yard, deliberately knocking over a stack of metal barrels with a loud crash, then running in the opposite direction into the snow, shouting the rambling words of a drunk man to lure the armed shadows after his own. Down in the sewer, Greta heard the pounding footsteps change direction. She heard the shouts, "Stop," and then she heard it, 2 dry cracks echoing through the concrete, clean and final, and she froze in the darkness, her whole body stiff, one hand clamped over her mouth to keep from crying out. Rourke seized her arm, his voice urgent but low. "You can't stop. He did that so you could go. If you stop, he dies for nothing. Move." And she moved 1 step at a time through the freezing sewer water that rose to her ankles, dragging the heavy man beside her, tears running down her face as she made no attempt to wipe them away. Because in 8 months on the streets, she had learned that people didn't have time to cry while they were running for their lives. They could only cry and run at the same time. At the end of the tunnel, the faint glow of a distant street lamp filtered down through the seam of the sewer cover. She pushed it up, crawled out into the snow-covered west alley, then pulled Rourke up after her, and both of them collapsed beside the wall for a moment, gasping, their breath twisting into smoke. Rourke looked at her, and beneath the dim amber glow, filtering into the alley, she saw something strange on his face, not relief at having escaped death, but something close to pain. "I don't understand him," he said softly, almost to himself. "He had nothing, he owed me nothing. He didn't even know who I was, and still." Greta wiped her face with the back of her freezing hand, her voice choked but sharp. "That's what you'll never understand about people like Wendell," she said. "He didn't do it for you. He did it because that's who he was. Because when people have nothing left, sometimes the only thing they still have is the choice to do the right thing one final time, and he chose. For me, for a stranger. And now you owe him one thing. You owe him surviving this day." Rourke bowed his head, and the man who had not cried in front of anyone in 20 years had to turn his face away, while behind them, in the old church with the crooked cross leaning from its roof, a homeless old man had just paid the final price for a kindness the world above had never shown him. They found shelter in an abandoned auto repair shop at the end of the alley, its rusted roll-up door only able to lift halfway, the inside dark and heavy with the smell of old motor oil, but sealed against the wind. and Greta let Rourke sit with his back against a cold brick wall before kneeling to check the wound again beneath the pale gray light slipping through the gap under the door. The stitches had been strained by the escape through the sewer, a fresh line of blood seeping through the bandage, and she muttered a curse under her breath. "You've torn it open. I have to wrap it again. Sit still." She peeled away the part of his shirt that was wet and filthy, revealing the wound and the dense web of old scars across this man's body, the marks of a violent life she did not ask about. And when her fingers touched his skin, she felt him go rigid, not from pain but from something else, and she realized, with a flash of surprise, that this man who could order deaths without blinking wasn't used to anyone touching him without the purpose of hurting him. "You can relax," she said softly as she cleaned the wound. "I'm not going to hurt you more than I have to." He looked down at her working hands and said in a low, rough voice, "It isn't you. It's been a long time since anyone touched me without trying to take something from me, or checking whether I was dead yet." The sentence hung suspended in the greasy air, and Greta paused for a beat, not out of pity, but because she realized she was seeing a real human being beneath the name that made an entire city lower its voice. A person lonely to the core in a way completely different from her own loneliness, but no less real. Still, she didn't let that sympathy soften what she needed to say, and as she tightened the fresh bandage, she asked directly without looking away. "These scars, the people you've given orders about, I watched an old man die because of me a few hours ago, and I can't sit here bandaging you and pretend you've never made other people cry the way I'm crying. What have you done? And have you ever regretted it?" Rourke didn't deny it, and that was what surprised her most. He didn't build some story to excuse himself. He only looked straight into her eyes and said, "I've done things that, if I told you, you would stand up and walk away, and you'd be right to do it. I'm not a good man, Greta. I've never pretended to be a good man. I believed my whole life that this world only had those who devoured and those who were devoured, and I chose never to be the one devoured." "Then why did you stop the car for me?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "A man like you had no reason to stop for a woman freezing at a bus stop." So I was silent for a long time, and when he answered, his voice was so quiet she had to lean closer to hear him. "I don't know," he said. "I've been asking myself that all night. Maybe because you sat there the way I felt inside, empty, abandoned, with no one left answering the phone, and for one moment I looked at you and saw myself. Then you opened your mouth, and instead of fearing me, you tried to save me. And Greta," he stopped, "all night being beside you, watching you give away things you didn't have, watching that old man die for a kindness I had forgotten still existed, you're reminding me that I could once have become someone else, before my father taught me that being good was suicide." Greta sat in silence, her hand still resting on the bandage over his chest, where she could feel his heartbeat, slow and heavy, and she said nothing, because between two people wounded by the world in opposite ways, silence was more honest now than any words, and both of them knew that the distance narrowing between them was something as dangerous as the men searching outside. It was at that very moment that Rourke's second phone vibrated again, and this time it wasn't an automatic alert but a call, an unknown number, and when he answered and pressed the phone to his ear, Greta saw his face change in a way she hadn't seen all night, not with physical pain, but with a naked fear that drained what little color remained from his already pale face. He said nothing for a long time, only listened, his fingers tightening around the phone until they turned white, and then from the other end of the line, she heard a man's voice, calm and almost intimate, the voice of someone who knew he was holding the strongest card, and though Greta couldn't make out every word, she caught one name that made her insides go cold, Maeve. When the call ended, Rourke lowered the phone very slowly and sat motionless, and it took him a while before he could shape the words. "He has my grandmother," he said, his voice dry and hollow. "Cillian has my grandmother." Greta knelt in front of him. "Tell me," and he told her, every word cutting into him as it came out. "Last night, before everything happened, she called Cillian. She doesn't know anything. To her, he's still the boy she watched grow up in the house. She trusts him like family, and when I disappeared, she got worried, so she called him to ask where I was. She accidentally told him she was alone, and now he's sent people to pick her up. He calls it protecting her while things are unstable, but you and I both know what it is." "A hostage," Greta said softly, and Rourke nodded. "A leash," he said. "He knows I'm alive. Now he's sure of it, and he knows that as long as he has her, I won't dare appear before the leaders with evidence, because if I expose him, the first thing he'll do is, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Greta looked at him, and in her mind every calculation from before collapsed and had to be rebuilt from the beginning, because the problem had changed. It was no longer one objective but two, the safe containing the evidence in the office at the main building, and the grandmother being held like a chess piece, and she immediately understood the cruel trap Cillian had set. If Rourke chose the evidence to save his whole empire, he might lose her, but if he chose to save her, he would have to give up the only thing that could prove his innocence, and would die as a traitor in everyone's eyes. He wants me to choose, Rourke said, his voice choking with a kind of feeling he had buried too deep. He knows me better than anyone. He grew up with me. He knows she's the one thing I can't bargain with, and he built this whole trap around that exact weakness. That's the cruelest part. He doesn't just want to kill me. He wants me to choose with my own hands between losing everything and losing the last person who still loves me. Greta placed a hand on his shoulder, and she spoke in the calm, cold voice she had once used in emergency room nights when everything seemed hopeless. Listen to me. You're letting him define the rules of the game. You're believing there are only two choices because he wants you to believe that, but I've spent my life in rooms where people told me only one person could be saved, and sometimes, just sometimes, if you're fast enough and reckless enough, you save both. Rourke lifted his eyes to her, and in the desperation there flashed a spark of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, hope, a dangerous kind of hope. And Greta went on, we're not going to save her first and then get the evidence, and we're not going to get the evidence first and then save her. We have to make him believe you've chosen one thing while you're actually doing the other, and to do that, I need you to tell me everything about that building, every entrance, every camera, every person, because the sun is coming up, and we don't have time to be afraid anymore. The plan depended on one thing Cillian would never expect, that Rourke wouldn't come through the front door like a kingpin, but would slip in like a shadow, and the key link in that plan was Greta, because beyond its office floors, the Halloran main building had a small internal clinic that the organization used to treat wounds that couldn't be taken to a public hospital. And every dawn there was a cleaning crew and a night shift nurse moving in and out through the rear service entrance, invisible people whose faces no one bothered to notice. Rourke knew that schedule, and he knew about the pale blue uniform hanging in the changing room by the back entrance. So before the sky had even begun to brighten, Greta had put on that nurse's uniform, pinned her hair neatly up, lowered her face, and walked into the very building that belonged to the enemy of the man she was risking her life to save, while Rourke pressed himself against the outside wall, waiting for her signal, too weak to go with her through security, but alert enough to guide her through the earpiece. She entered through the service door with the card one of Rourke's remaining loyal people had left beneath a potted plant as instructed, and the night guard sitting behind the desk only glanced up for 1 second, saw the familiar uniform, saw a tired woman with her head lowered like any other night shift worker, then looked back down at his screen. But at the second scanner, the system didn't accept the card. A red beep sounded, and the guard looked up with a frown. "What's wrong with your card?" he asked, and for one moment Greta's heart seemed to stop, but the mind trained to handle crisis in an emergency room took over before fear had time to crawl onto her face. She sighed exactly like an exhausted, irritated employee. "This again," she said. "This card reader has been acting up all week. Have you called maintenance yet? I still have 2 patients who need bandage changes before shift handoff." And she held the card out again with the annoyance of someone far too used to petty malfunctions, without letting even a trace of panic show, and it was that ordinary, indignant calm that convinced him more than any paperwork could have. He waved a hand. Fine, go on. I'll write it down manually." And the door opened. Inside, Greta moved along the dim service corridor, her heart hammering, Rourke's voice whispering in her ear as he guided her through each turn. "Right. Avoid the camera in the ceiling corner. Wait. Someone's there." She slipped into a wall recess as 2 of Cillian's men passed within an arm's length of her, talking about guarding the exits, and she held her breath until their footsteps faded, then continued. "Stairwell," Rourke instructed. "Don't use the elevator. 7th floor, my office." And she climbed 1 step at a time in the darkness, her legs aching, her lungs burning, fully aware that outside, The sky was shifting from black into the lead gray of dawn. That every minute passing meant the district leaders were arriving one by one in the council room on the top floor, where Cillian was preparing the performance in which he would announce Rourke's death. When she reached the 7th floor, she cracked the stairwell door and looked out. The hallway was empty, but at the far end stood one figure guarding the office door, a very young man, thin, holding a gun awkwardly as though he wasn't yet used to its weight, and through the earpiece Rourke let out a soft sound when Greta described him. "That's Petey," he said. "The 19-year-old boy I told you about. Cillian put him there because he thinks no one would dare come to this place." Greta looked at that young face, trying so hard to appear tough, then spoke softly into the earpiece. "Let me handle this. I know what to say to a frightened child." Then she pushed the door open and stepped into the hallway, walking toward the young man, with both bare hands raised slightly, while to the east beyond the wide glass window, the horizon began to crack with its first streak of light. Before she could get close to Petey, the door at the end of the hallway flew open, and every calculation shattered, because the person who stepped out was not another guard, but Cillian himself, tall and composed in a dark suit, with 2 armed men behind him. His gaze swept over Greta in the nurse's uniform, then stopped, and a thin smile appeared on his lips. "You don't belong in this building," he said in a voice so gentle it was chilling, "and I know the face of everyone authorized to come up to the 7th floor, so the only question is who brought you in." At the same moment, at the other end of the hallway, the stairwell door opened and Rourke stepped out, one hand pressed to his side, his face white as paper but his body still upright, and when Cillian saw him, the smile on his lips stalled for 1 second, only 1 second, before stretching into something both triumphant and bitter. "You're still alive," he said. "Of course you are. You've always been harder to kill than people think. That was what Father liked most about you." The whole hallway froze in a standoff, gun barrels hovering, and Rourke spoke, his voice hoarse but steady. "Let her go, Cillian. This is between you and me. She has nothing to do with it." But Cillian only tilted his head, and when he spoke, all the years of resentment poured out not through shouting, but through a calmness even more terrifying. "Nothing to do with it," he said. "You still sound exactly like Father, as though some people matter and some people don't. Do you know what that feels like, Rourke? To spend your whole life standing inside a house you call home while everyone quietly understands that you're only a guest." Rourke was silent, and Cillian took 1 step forward. 20 years, he said. 20 years I cleaned up the things you broke. I thought up moves you claimed as your own. I stood behind you in every room and smiled while you didn't even bother remembering I was there. And I told myself it was all right, that one day he would see, one day he would say blood wasn't everything. But that day never came. Father stood in front of everyone and handed the crown to you, only because you happened to be born in the right place. And I still stood there applauding, Rourke. I still applauded. There was a moment inside those words when even Greta, frozen between 2 lines of fire, felt something ache in her chest, because she realized the tragedy was not that Cillian was lying, but that everything he said was true. He really had been treated as though he did not exist year after year, and the dangerous man now holding all their lives in his hands had been shaped by the very contempt of the people who should have loved him. Rourke understood that. She saw it on his face, and he spoke in a voice that had softened, not to beg, but because for the first time he was truly seeing the man in front of him. "You're right," he said. "I treated you like a shadow. I took what belonged to you. I let you endure a disrespect you never deserved, and I'm sorry for that. I'm truly sorry. But Cillian, what I did wrong to you doesn't give you the right to take an 80-year-old woman hostage. It doesn't give you the right to kill 2 of my men last night. If you want to blame me, then blame me. But don't turn yourself into the very monster you were always afraid people thought you were." For a moment, Cillian's face wavered. One very brief moment when the homeless boy from years ago appeared beneath the mask of the man about to seize the throne. One moment when the apology he had waited 20 years to hear had finally arrived. But then that moment closed, hardened, because when people have gone too far down a road, sometimes an apology that comes too late doesn't heal. It only cuts deeper. "Too late," Cillian said quietly, his voice catching for an instant before turning cold again. "You should have said that 10 years ago." Then he gave a slight nod to the men with guns. "Take them both to the council room. The leaders will be here soon. and I want them to see with their own eyes how traitors end. In the vast council room, with its long wooden table and glass windows overlooking the city, as it began to brighten, Maeve sat in a chair, small and straight-backed, her silver hair neatly pinned, her eyes still sharp though her hands were trembling, and when she saw Rourke shoved inside, she called his name softly in a breaking voice, while he answered, "I'm here, grandmother, I'm here." And the whole room seemed to sink for a beat. Cillian stood at the head of the table, drew out his own gun, and set it on the wood, then said with a weariness that sounded almost regretful, "The leaders will be here in 10 minutes, and when they arrive, they'll see that you died while breaking in to assassinate me, and she will confirm whatever I need her to confirm, because she knows better than anyone what happens when someone refuses." He jerked his head toward Petey, the 19-year-old boy standing close to the wall, the gun trembling in his hand, and gave the order. "You, do it. This is when you prove where you belong. Shoot him." The whole room turned toward the boy, and Greta, though she herself stood close to death, turned to him and spoke in the strangely calm voice she had once used to keep panicked patients from doing something that couldn't be undone. "Look at me, sweetheart. Don't look at him. Look at me. I know who you are. You're the boy with no home, no one waiting for you, and he found you when you were most desperate and told you this was family. I know because the world abandoned me too, but listen to me. What you're about to do won't give you a home. It will only take away who you are and turn you into something he can throw away tomorrow. If you pull that trigger, there's no road back for you. If you put the gun down, you're still a boy who can choose differently." Petey looked at her, his eyes filling with tears, the gun wavering between Rourke and the floor, and Cillian shouted, "Shoot him." But that name no longer sounded like an older brother. It sounded like the very voice that had been giving orders to him all his life, and the boy did what no one in the room expected. He lowered the gun and stepped back, shaking his head, his voice broken. "I can't do it." And, in that exact unstable moment, Rourke gave the signal, because all along he had secretly sent out the one thing he still had left, not from the safe Cillian had taken, but a copy of the evidence he had always kept as protection, sent straight to the phones of the leaders already on their way. And at that very moment, the council room doors burst open, not by Cillian's men, but by 2 loyal district leaders and their people. Men who had just read the black and white truth of who had truly betrayed whom, and they flooded in with weapons raised, aimed not at Rourke but at Cillian. In a single heartbeat, everything erupted into chaos. Cillian understood that his game had just collapsed, and in the desperation of a man who had lost everything, he snatched the gun from the table and aimed it at the one person who could still hurt him. Not Rourke, but Maeve, the mother he had never truly had, the living symbol of the family that had rejected him, and he pulled the trigger. But between the barrel and the old woman stood Greta, who had read that intention in Cillian's eyes half a second before everyone else, the half-second of an emergency nurse used to seeing disaster before it happened, and she didn't have time to think. She only lunged forward, throwing her whole body over Maeve, and the bullet meant for an 80-year-old woman buried itself in her instead. The gunshot thundered through the room, then Greta fell, and at the same time the district leader's men overpowered Cillian, slamming him to the floor, the gun skidding away, the coup ending not in glory but in the sound of Rourke screaming her name. He rushed forward and dropped to his knees beside her, despite his own wound, both hands pressing against the blood spreading across the pale blue nurse's uniform, while Maeve knelt shakily on the other side, and in the corner of the room Petey stood frozen, the gun fallen at his feet, the 19-year-old boy who had just been saved by a stranger from becoming a killer now watching that very stranger lying in a pool of blood. And he began to cry, crying for something that had been saved, and something that had been lost in the same breath. Rourke pressed both hands down on her wound so hard that his knuckles turned white, yet blood kept spilling warm through his fingers in the cold room, and he did the one thing this man had not done in 20 years. He begged. "Stay with me," he said, his voice breaking, with nothing left of the kingpin who made the whole city lower its voice. "Do you hear me? You're not allowed to do this. Not for me. Don't die for me." But even as he spoke, he had already pulled out his phone, and this was the moment that made him choke halfway through, because he began calling his private doctor, calling his men, calling anyone who might come save her, and he pressed the phone to his ear and waited with the wild eyes of a man who, for the first time in his life, understood the terror of calling, without knowing whether anyone would answer. The very terror she had lived with at the bus stop the night before, when she had called the whole world and the whole world had stayed silent. The phone rang once, twice, and in that moment, Rourke's entire universe shrank down to a single question. Would anyone answer for her? Would the woman who had answered for him, when no one else would answer, be given the same mercy by the world? And then a voice came on the other end, his doctor waking and answering, and Rourke shouted the address and her condition into the phone with everything left in his chest. "Hurry," he said. "I'm begging you, hurry. I've never begged you for anything. I'm begging you for this." Beneath him, Greta whispered, and he bent close to listen, because even now, even when she was the one lying in a pool of blood, the instinct that had followed her all her life still refused to go out. "Press harder," she breathed. "Your hand is off. Move it down a little below the rib. There. Press straight down and don't lift it, even if you see blood." And he obeyed every word she said. The man who had once given orders to hundreds now trembling as he followed the instructions of a woman slipping toward unconsciousness. And she went on, brokenly, "Keep me awake. Say something, ask me something." Just as she had told him to count backward the night before to keep him in this world, now it was his turn to keep her here. Rourke spoke. He said anything he could to fill the terrifying silence. He told her about the small house he would take her to, about how he would restore her name, about all the things he had never promised anyone. "Can you hear me?" he said. "You have to live so you can make me keep my word. You're the only person in this world who dares give me orders, and I won't let you leave halfway through." Maeve held Greta's cooling hand between her own wrinkled ones, whispering old prayers, while Petey had dropped to his knees beside them, the boy she had just saved now pressing his jacket against the wound to help Rourke, doing the only thing he could do to repay a small part of the debt that had just been borne. And all three of those wildly different people, a kingpin, an old woman, and a lost boy, gathered around a woman none of them had known only a few hours earlier, holding on to her, pulling her back toward this side of life. From far away came the sound of sirens, growing closer and closer, and Rourke lowered his head until his forehead was near hers, begging one final time in a whisper only she could hear. "Don't leave me alone with the world you just reminded me was still worth living in." Greta's eyes were half closed, her breath fragile as a thread, but her chest was still rising, still trying, still refusing to let go. The bullet didn't take her life, though it almost did. And for the first several weeks, Greta lay in a bright room filled with the best equipment money could buy, recovering slowly and painfully through 2 surgeries, and every time she opened her eyes, Rourke was there, not always saying anything, just sitting there, the man who once hadn't given his time to anyone, now giving all of it to one person. When winter melted into spring and she could walk again, she began to understand that this man was quietly doing things she'd never expected, not becoming a saint, because she knew he wasn't one and never would be, but beginning to take apart, piece by piece, the darkest parts of the empire he'd inherited. The hospital that had once crushed her, the money laundering machine that had run for years through phantom bills and patients who didn't exist, had been dragged into the light by the very evidence Rourke held, and Dr. Abernathy. The man whose actions had caused Greta's whole life to collapse, now faced charges that none of his powerful friends dared step forward to shield him from anymore, because the people who'd once protected him had either fallen with Cillian, or had been smart enough to pull away from a sinking ship. Rourke didn't do it as some clean act of atonement, and he told her that honestly. "I can't give back what I took from people in the past," he said, "and I won't stand here pretending a few good acts can erase the things I've done, but the network that ruined you is something I can break, and the honor it stole from you is something I can return. That's something I can do, so I'm doing it." And he truly did. The fabricated records that had once made no one dare hire her were removed. The name Greta Voss was erased from the invisible blacklist that had spent 8 months closing every door in her face. And one morning she received a letter inviting her to have her nursing license restored, along with an official apology from the very medical board that had turned its back on her, late and dry, but real. But what left her most speechless was when Rourke brought her to see a low building on the edge of the South Side, the neighborhood where people like Wendell lived and died without anyone caring. And he said, "This is a clinic, free for people who have nothing. I had it repaired last month, and it needs someone to run it, who knows how to look at a person in rags and still see a human being. I don't know anyone better at that than you. Greta stood in the room that still smelled of fresh paint, looking at the clean hospital beds, the fully stocked medicine cabinets, the small sign outside the door that still had no name on it, and she understood that this wasn't a gift meant to buy her conscience, but an acknowledgement that the kindness that had once cost her everything hadn't been a mistake, that it was the one thing worth building into a place. She asked him where the money to build it had come from, because she wouldn't stand there if it came from blood, and Rourke nodded, knowing she'd ask exactly that. It came from the legal parts of the business, the parts I'm trying to make into all that's left. I'm selling off or shutting down the rest, slowly, because if I move too fast, my people die. But I'm doing it, and you can stand there watching me and make sure I do it right. She looked at him for a long time, this scarred and guilty man who was trying, not perfectly, not cleanly, not quickly, but truly trying to become something better than the man his father had shaped him into. And for the first time since that night at the bus stop, Greta felt a warmth that didn't come from a heater or a blanket, but from somewhere inside her, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, her kindness hadn't died in vain after all. But Greta wasn't someone who lied to herself, and she understood very clearly that standing beside Rourke wasn't stepping into a fairy tale, but choosing to live with a thorny truth every single day. There were nights when he came home late, with a closed-off look on his face that she had learned how to read, nights when he had to handle the parts of his world that couldn't be dismantled by goodwill alone. And she didn't ask everything, because there were answers she knew she didn't want to carry. But she also didn't pretend they didn't exist. She set a boundary from the beginning, clear and bare. I won't live with a man who lies to me, she told him. You don't have to tell me everything, but you're not allowed to turn me into someone naive. The day you start hiding things to protect my feelings is the day I walk out the door. And he respected that, perhaps because he understood that the only thing that could keep this woman was not money or protection, but honesty, the thing they had both paid too dearly to earn. And because of that, neither of them dared throw it away. Cillian wasn't killed, a detail Greta deliberately followed so she could reassure herself that the man she had chosen to stay beside truly was changing. Rourke could have dealt with him the way the old world dealt with such things, and no one would have questioned it, but he didn't. He let the leaders judge him by their own rules, and Cillian was stripped of all power and sent far away, alive but empty-handed. And when Greta asked why he hadn't chosen a more final ending, Rourke was silent for a while before saying, "Because I helped create him. Killing him would be easy. Living with the knowledge that I helped turn an abandoned boy into that is harder, and I think I owe him the harder thing." Maeve, the woman Greta had taken a bullet for, now treated her like blood, often coming to the clinic to sit for whole afternoons, knitting and telling Greta stories about Rourke, as a little boy before the world, had worn that child down into stone, and through her stories, Greta came to understand more deeply that people were not born cruel, but were taught cruelty by circumstance, and if it could be learned, then the opposite could be learned again, slowly and painfully, but still learned. Petey, the 19-year-old boy, now did small jobs at the clinic, sweeping, carrying things, delivering medicine. Greta had asked Rourke to pull him out of the world of guns, and he agreed. And every time she watched the boy lower his head in embarrassment while accepting thanks from an elderly patient, she remembered the moment in the council room when he lowered his gun, and she knew that saving a person from becoming a killer was sometimes even more important than saving a person from death. As for herself, she reopened the door to her profession, not in a grand hospital with her name on a wall, but in this small clinic where her patients were the people the city had forgotten, the homeless, the addicts trying to get clean, the mothers without papers who didn't dare go to a public hospital, and she bandaged their wounds, prescribed their medicine, and more important than anything, looked at them in a way no one had looked at them in a very long time as whole and complete human beings. Sometimes at the end of the day, Rourke came to pick her up, standing in the doorway as he watched her work, and in his eyes there was something that money and power had never brought him in all his life: peace. And both of them knew that what they were building wasn't perfect, wasn't clean, wasn't guaranteed to last, but it was real, more real than anything they had ever had. And for two people who had once lost everything, because they dared to live truthfully, perhaps that was already the most precious thing in the world. One late spring evening, after the work at the clinic was done and the last patients had gone home, Rourke drove Greta along Weston Road. And without arranging it, both of them fell silent when the car slowed beside the old bus stop. The same metal roof, the same bench, now beneath the warm yellow glow of the street lamp instead of the blinding white snow of the night. That had changed everything. He stopped the car, and they sat there for a while, looking out at the place where, many months earlier, a woman had sat with every last bit of hope drained out of her, and a man had nearly driven past her the way he had driven past thousands of other people in his life. And Rourke said softly, "All my life I thought that night I stopped to save you." Greta turned to look at him. "And now?" she asked. And he answered in a low voice that had left so many hard layers behind. "Now I know the truth was the other way around. You were the one who saved me, not from death, but from the man I had become. I lived nearly 40 years believing that stopping for someone else was weakness. And the very night I stopped for you, the night I thought I was giving mercy, was the first night I was allowed to become human again." She said nothing, only placed her hand over his, because between them now there were truths that no longer needed to be framed in words. And they both understood what this quiet bus stop had taught them, that the world doesn't change because powerful people make grand decisions, but changes in very small moments when someone, in the middle of the cold and the rush and their own fear, chooses to stop instead of driving on, chooses to see a human being where others see only a shadow by the road. And this story, ladies and gentlemen, is not, in the end, a story about a kingpin or a bullet or an empire, but a story about human dignity, about the simple truth we so often forget, that the worth of a person is not measured by the balance in their bank account, or by their status, or by the clothes they are wearing, that the woman freezing at the bus stop in the red dress, and the homeless man who died inside the old church, both carried within them a dignity as whole, and complete as anyone seated in glass towers. And the only thing we truly owe one another in this life is to stop long enough to see that. The story closes not with a wedding or a castle, but with a simple image, in the small clinic on the edge of the South Side on an ordinary afternoon. Greta kneeling before a stranger who has just stepped in from the street, someone ragged and freezing whom the whole city has grown used to turning away from, and she gently takes that wounded hand in hers, looks up, smiles, and asks their name before asking anything else, because she knows that sometimes the greatest gift we can give another human being is not medicine or money, but simply the chance to be recognized as human. And so the cycle of kindness that a homeless old man once gave to her, that she gave to a lost boy, continues to spread from one hand to another, quietly and steadily. And that is how a little light can survive even the longest nights. If tonight's story has touched something in your hearts, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with the people you love, so that every day we can continue listening together to beautiful and meaningful stories like this one. How do you feel about this story? In your own life, have you ever been the person who stopped beside some bus stop? Or have you ever been the one someone stopped for? Please leave a few lines in the comments to share your story and the feelings deep in your heart, because we truly hope to listen. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. We sincerely wish all of you listening abundant health, a joyful life, peace of mind, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.